well, is simultaneously straightforward but also kind of complex. A lot of us have heard about the paradox of tolerance, right? And a lot of us also have first-hand experience of kind of the fact that you can't necessarily always be open-minded 100% of the time. So where do we get that balance, right? Being open-minded is mostly about accepting people for who they are, but also where they are currently at. Because when your idea of, for instance, liberation is solely contingent on somebody else agreeing with the same exact things that you do, it can get problematic, right? Because by default, you are positioning yourself as the ultimate pinnacle of virtue. You're viewing yourself as having some sense of assumed superiority when the reality is that life is never that simple. And many of us, have the sense of hubris sometimes. Even those of us who have struggles with things like mental health or depression, anxiety, all that, a lot of us can, really, really struggle with that, but also still struggle with, a sense of hubris, a sense that, maybe we are more virtuous, more moral, etc. And a lot of the times we use ethical ideas to simply, I guess, frame things in, from our personal perspective, rather than really look at things from a broader perspective, if that makes sense. A lot of us tend to think that, hey, if I was able to do this, then they should be able to do it too. But the problem with that framing is that we forget all of the bullshit that we've been through, and we forget that it took us a very long time, right, to get to a point where we are more aware, where we've begun to see things in ways that are different from our upbringing, if that is something that describes you, right? A lot of us have had to go through a lot of bullshit personally in our own lives with the people that we know, love, and cherish in order to get to a point where we are actually, I guess, not validating ourselves, but to a place where we're seeing things a lot more objectively and open-mindedly. Because truth of the matter is that it is a lot easier to simply not question everything, and it's a lot easier to just go with the flow, right? Do what life tells you to do, or seemingly tells you to do what is basically the path of least resistance. And that's something that we really need to understand when it comes to, why people think the way that they do. Why do people believe in certain things? Why don't they rid themselves of their indoctrination? Why are they not responding to, you know, people either on the left or even liberals who just like shout at them, right? Why are they not responding to that type of messaging? It's because it's easier to do what you're told and not question things. That's why so many Americans, for instance, simp for billionaires, because they don't know better. They don't understand and realize that they are being exploited, and that ultimately the path to their future being better and their children's future and their subsequent generations' collective futures to be better is to upend the current state of things, the current systems that rule over not only the US but also over the entire world. And we are meant to think this way, to think that we are more isolated than we really are. And we're also meant to think that we are a lot less able to change things, right? Because, a lot of times in like when I've had like therapy in the past, it's talking about like the spheres of influence, or the circles of influence. What can you control? What can you kind of control? And what do you have zero control over? But the thing about that type of framing as well is that it makes the assumption that you don't work in tandem with other people, that you don't work in tandem with any kind of group or collective effort to make things a lot better for you and your family, right? It also makes the assumption that the system is the way that it is, and so we can't really change it, and so it's any efforts to resist are futile. But the problem with that, of course, is that we have seen what accepting the system for what it currently is and what it has been has done, right? For the most part, in the last election, right, a lot of the left and a lot of liberals basically just dropped the ball, to be honest. Because we sort of assumed that, no matter who was in office, things were going to stay the same. And of course, I didn't even vote for the other candidate, the other major party candidate, but we have definitely seen that this current administration is and has been allowed to do so much bullshit because they were voted back in power. And so they believe that they have this mandate now, that they are allowed to just usurp people's rights. As a result, even the ceasefire that was brokered before his inauguration ended up backfiring, ended up just like being completely ruined, and in large part because he had the hubris to basically just be like, I want to make my own ceasefire, and now we have, that ceasefire. Thankfully, it's holding, but at what cost, right? Tens of thousands of Palestinian people have been murdered as a result of his encouragement to Netanyahu to break the ceasefire. And so while there are people who seemingly have political amnesia and somehow do not remember that just 9 months ago there was already a ceasefire that was brokering peace and that had restored peace at least for a few weeks. Yeah. Like, it's just one example of how we are all basically getting played by the current people in power, the current systems that have all the control over all of our resources, all of our hopes and dreams, all of our capacities, etc. And so, of course, with that context, things can feel very hopeless, right? And that's the importance of understanding that we need to be open-minded. We need to remain as open-minded, as persistent as possible in building the type of world that we want to see occur for not only us, but also for future generations. And so we also have to understand that we are not on little islands anymore. That is just not the way that modern society works anymore. We are interconnected. We have access to people from all over the world. We can communicate now with people who have different perspectives, who have different opinions, who have different mindsets. And so that's the reason why we need to be as open-minded as possible. Because ultimately, when we are only viewing things from our personal perspectives, we tend to ignore those of others, right? I have my perspective, but my perspective may not be what somebody else of a different background would necessarily see as any semblance of liberation, right? But at the same time, maybe them finding out about my perspective and maybe me finding out about their perspective can mesh our perspectives to be a lot closer and to be a lot more open-minded. It's not just, a moderating effect, though it is important to, in these times of political polarization, to actually allow ourselves to take a step back and smell the roses and remember the humanity in others, right? People are only what they have been taught to be. And that's something that we have to remember, right? Most people are only what they have been taught to be, whether they learn new things later in life or whether they have perspectives at 18 and, act on them, right? And it's really not just about affirming just anyone and just everyone's perspectives. It's deconstructing what it means to be human and understanding that humanity requires us to remember humanity. Remember that it exists and that it has many variants. And to also remember that, even the little things count, right? And so that's kind of the thing about hate speech, which is kind of the topic that I'm covering with my, was basically my final project for my master's in data science program that I'm doing right now. Basically, I've been looking at hate speech data sets, and I've been looking at, the different factors surrounding hate speech, such as, how somebody perceives hate speech, how somebody perceives a particular type of speech, as well as the actual words themselves, right? With some of the data sets, I have found that, it is more than enough to just kind of gauge what different variables, what different features, columns, etc. are involved in hate speech and try to predict if, a group will be targeted or not, or what types of groups will be targeted based off of, like the sentiment that's associated with a particular type of speech, even if you don't have like the actual words, right? And then with two of the datasets that I was working with, that was definitely not enough. My accuracy level was like below 60%. But when last night I was working on building like a neural network model to analyze 6 different like variants of 3 of my datasets, and I found that they actually were a lot more accurate, right? Some of them were, less than stellar, but others were, a lot better and a lot more accurate, and they were able to better classify something as either hate speech or classify something as being, targeted towards like one group or another. And really the point of like me mentioning that is because there are a lot of variables when it comes to like what constitutes hate speech, why people say hate speech to begin with. Far and large, one of the main reasons for why hate speech has become so rampant as of late is because of economic hardship. Political polarization normally increases during times of hardship. 1930s Germany, Imperial Japan. In many ways, like when a people are distracted by, not being able to have enough food, not being able to have enough, money to pay rent, all of that type of stuff, hate speech does become more prominent. And what happens after hate speech is that the violence increases more and more and more until, different groups are being targeted. That's what we're currently seeing here in the US. In the US, we saw, over the years, a slow but steady rise in hate speech against Indian Americans, against trans people, and the like. And we've seen more and more that this hate speech transformed into acts of physical violence, whether it be ICE detentions of mostly Latino, but also Asian Americans as well, and Haitian Americans as well, or, just trans people not being safe anywhere in the country right now, at least anywhere that there is like a Republican majority in government, since states like Wisconsin, which once had explicit protections for trans people, have since revoked them in recent years. So yeah, there's just a lot of different things at play, but ultimately we can attribute the rise of, hate overall and political polarization in recent times in the US to the acceptance of hate speech due to political polarization, due to economic hardship, unfortunately. Because, of course, that's part of the conversation about like spheres of influence, spheres of control, right? You currently do not think that you can control your material conditions, and so you're going to try to exert control over a more vulnerable group that is also currently suffering from a lot of the same issues that you are, but because you feel like you need to wage some type of control and let your aggression out, then you are going to attempt to exert power over someone who is trans, someone who is Latino, someone who is Indian American, etc. Right? Because you do not feel like you have any control over your current circumstances. Because that is by design, by the system. The system wants all of us to blame each other before we blame it. Blame ourselves, then blame each other. Until there's no one else to blame. And then, some people react to that by basically self-deletion. Some people react to that by just drinking alcohol, doing drugs, all of that. People cope in a lot of different ways. Some people gamble, some people do whatever, and then some people, they do hate speech online, and then they also do hateful actions in person. Right? Because all of those things are things that they can more or less control and exert agency over themselves and their circumstances. Even if it's using like really bad habits like drug use, right? And in the more extreme cases, self-deletion, that's permanent, obviously. But that's why we have such high rates of that here in the US. That's why we have such high rates of drug use in the US as well. That's why we also have such high rates of sexually transmitted infections, right? Because a lot of people just do not feel like they can control anything in their lives. And so it's just like, okay, well, if I can't control anything, then why am I going to like restrict the things that I want to do, right? Even if they don't really have like a logical reason to want to do like risky behavior, they will still act on a lot of risky behavior. Because like to them, life is so short that like why not? Like just why not? Why not engage in sleeping with this many people? Why not engage in drug use? Why not engage in gluttony? Personally, I struggle with that one. Like so many of us have like things that we are addicted to, things like bad habits that we need to change and that we engage in like kind of without logical reason, because we feel like we can't really control anything. We can't control our own circumstances, we can't control the government, etc. Right? However, of course, there are people who end up doing a combination, right? Because obviously I would be remiss to say that like the current protests that are currently happening in the Philippines, Madagascar, Nepal, other parts of the East and Southeast Asian world, and hopefully spreading into parts of Africa and even other continents, right? All of these like quote unquote Gen Z movements for liberation are happening, It is the risk taking that the system did not want for us to engage in. But it is the type of risk taking that does ultimately result in positive social change. Personally, I do support like many of those movements, not only because they are mostly intersectional in nature, they see the parallels between themselves and their own material conditions, as well as those of, other populations, right? And so, in a lot of ways, they are very intertwined. And so, the nature of their, what do you call it? The nature of their protest is very global. They understand that, they're able to do the things that they're able to do because they have examples from, people of other nations, from people of, other struggles, etc. And ultimately, I feel like that's something that we have to consider doing right here at home, right? Many of us have seen the frog protesters in Portland. A lot of us have seen, anti-ICE protests, pro-Palestinian protests, etc., that have resulted, that have had like mixed results for the most part. But at the same time, we see people of courage when we view like that type of content, right? We see people who are, fighting for their rights, but also fighting for the rights of other people, because not everyone in those protests are, at risk. The primary people at risk, undocumented people, for instance, they are usually not at these protests for their own safety, right? Whereas, you have documented people of Latino descent, of Asian descent, of Black descent, who are white. Also, like, you're seeing a lot of people in these types of protests. And being able to more or less like fight for, their own communities, because ultimately those undocumented people who are at risk, they are, part of their community. You can't spell community without unity, right? So I think it's really important just to be open-minded, but also to be patient with people, ultimately. Because not everyone's going to get it the first time, but with some persistence, hopefully they will get it one day. Because if the belief is that everyone deserves liberation, then why restrict it? Why limit it? Why would we ever believe that somebody doesn't deserve that, doesn't deserve freedom, just because they think differently from us, at least at this point in time? Why do we have to means test people's deserving of liberation when we believe that, people should have basic human rights, people should have basic, just basic necessities as a whole? Because if that's the case, then why do we not see liberation as a basic necessity? Why would we ever view liberation as something that, like, not everyone deserves? That's the logic, personally, to me. That's, like, the thing, personally, for me, that I struggle with understanding. Like, just this disconnect overall between what we say we believe. If you are someone on the left and just the way that we treat people. Because those people that we are treating badly, many of them have less privilege than we do. And when they do have more economic privilege, they have a lot of trauma that they have to undo in their own lives. A lot of trauma that they don't even know is trauma to begin with. So, yeah. I just feel like we need to be a lot more patient with, like, humans in general. With the fact that people are valuable. Not everyone is going to get it at first. Not everyone's gonna be nice. But, like, being nice to you is not, ultimately the clear requirement for whether or not someone should have liberation. Being human, to me, is reason enough to want to see someone else be liberated, right? So yeah, maybe I will end it here. Thanks for watching. Take care.